Well, amid a frenzy of activity and divisions around the Parliament today, a significant new policy's been launched which has the potential to greatly change the way doctors deal with autism and where their patients would sit within the disability insurance scheme. One of the people responsible is the Families and Social Services Minister, Paul Fletcher, who joined us in the studio a moment ago. Well, Paul Fletcher, welcome back. Autism isn't a new condition in Australia, but it is sharply on the rise, and you've come up with this new guideline for diagnosis. What's the practical effect of this?
What we've announced today is a new national guideline for the diagnosis of autism. This is essentially a tool for clinicians, medical practitioners and health professionals around Australia as they make an assessment and a diagnosis of whether somebody has autism spectrum disorder. We have seen some variability in the diagnosis practices around the country. So this piece of work has been underway for some 12 months or so. It's been funded by the National Disability Insurance Agency. And one of the reasons is that a significant proportion of people who are supported by the National Disability Insurance Scheme have autism. In fact, it's about 30%. This piece of work has been done by the Autism Cooperative Research Centre. That's a group of some 7 universities hosted at the University of Queensland. It's been extensively developed. They've consulted with some 1,000 individuals and stakeholders. It's been to the National Health and Medical Research Council, who've endorsed it, and it's now something that is coming into force.
Yeah, so it checks out and it brings a national consistency, to be sure. But what is the effect for someone, let's start first of all, someone who does suffer autism and is currently in the NDIS? Would they lose any funding, any support under their plan?
It has no impact on people who are currently supported by the NDIS on the basis of having autism as a disability.
Okay. What about those who are outside of it, may not even yet be aware that autism is in the family or an issue? Is it a higher bar now to get care under the NDIS in the future because of these guidelines?
Again, we don't believe that's going to be the case. So what happens is, when you go to the National Disability Insurance Agency and say, I would like support under the National Disability Insurance Scheme, you get assessed on the basis of your disability, be it autism or anything else, and the question that's asked is it likely to be permanent or lifelong impairment, and how significant is the impairment of your functioning? Now, one of the inputs into that process, in the case of autism or any other disability, is of course your medical or clinical diagnosis. So the effect of this guideline will be to have some influence over the uniformity of diagnoses coming into the process. It does not change what the NDIS does, and indeed it may well be that there are people who today would not be diagnosed who will be diagnosed. That'll be a judgment for clinicians and medical professionals. The NDIS will continue to do what it does, which is make an assessment of the impairment that somebody suffers as a result of a disability. Is it likely to be permanent and lifelong? Is it significant? What impact does it have on their functioning?
But the growth in diagnosis of autism has been very sharp in the last decade. I think it's running just under 80%. Is it your expectation that with these guidelines, that rate might slow?
Look, what this is about is a more uniform approach to the diagnosis. The diagnosis is made by a medical professional. We'll have to wait and see what the impacts of this are, but what this is about is having a more consistent approach so that around Australia somebody with the same symptoms, the same behaviours, has the same likelihood of being diagnosed.
All right, well, that will show up in the data over time. Can I take you to a couple of other news matters of the day? I believe the Liberal Party did discuss, or in some of the party meetings this morning, there were discussions about Nauru and offshore detention. There seems to be a view in the government that New Zealand might now start to become a more viable option, subject to certain safeguards. Do you support that view that it is time to examine more creative ways to get people off Nauru?
Well, look, the Prime Minister was asked about this in question time yesterday. He made some comments about this very issue. A number of my colleagues have said that they'll be raising this with the Prime Minister, so I'll leave it for that process to work its way through. What I would say is it is very important that we maintain strong border protection. Under the previous Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, we saw 1,200 people tragically drown at sea, some 50,000 unauthorised arrivals. It is very important that we maintain strong border protection. So
but not just in your party, but more generally in the community. Is there a bit of a momentum shift, a bit of a tide change in attitudes, do you think, about the longevity of people who are now fully recognised refugees remaining on Nauru as long as they have?
Let's make it clear, the reason that there are people on Nauru is because the previous Labor government mismanaged our borders, lost control of the process. Let's also make it clear that we are working hard to resolve these issues, finding people a pathway, for example, to the United States, and several hundred people have now been able to move to the United States. They've been accepted under the arrangements that we've struck with the Obama administration, which were honoured by the Trump administration. And so this is an issue we are working through systematically, but I make the point, the reason that we have people on Nauru and on Manus is because of the terrible mismanagement of border security by the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. And if Labor comes back to government, one thing you can be sure of is we'll see the same mismanagement again.
All right, and foreign policy. Quite clearly the Prime Minister wants to push the boundaries, explore some options in the Middle East, in Israel in particular. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, I make the point that a significant input into the Prime Minister's decision was advice from Dave Sharma, our Liberal candidate for Wentworth.
Is that appropriate? Is he the best expert to take advice from?
Well, of course, the Prime Minister took advice very widely, but Dave is, of course, a former Australian ambassador to Israel. He's got very deep subject matter expertise in this area, and he wrote earlier this year about potential options for this approach in the context of a two-state solution, a peaceful solution. So I think the Prime Minister has spoken today. There's extensive media coverage of his openness to look at this. Would
there be diplomatic costs, though? I suppose that's the question. You can get creative, you can move embassies, you can recognise capitals, but at what risk, particularly to unsettling relations? Name them, let's say Indonesia for one. It's a balancing act, isn't it?
And of course, everything in foreign policy is a balancing act. We have a strong commitment to a peaceful two-state solution, Israel and Palestine. That has not changed. What the Prime Minister has said is that he's open to looking at whether the Australian Embassy could be located in Jerusalem within that context. And of course, our Dave Sharma, who is our candidate for Wentworth, but very importantly, formerly Australia's ambassador to Israel, has spoken publicly about this. I think it's a creative approach, and I certainly welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has put it on the agenda.
Yeah, it's a conversation to be had. Paul Fletcher, for your thoughts both in family and social services, but also beyond them. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Greg.